care am ajuns atunci. Și pot să vă mărturisesc acum, cu 2 zile înainte de predică o țineam în fiecare miercuri din săptămână.
Și ne-am întors încet. A fost foarte dureroasă întoarcerea noastră. N-a fost
Between my first period of imprisonment and the second period, there was no difference. The torture, the brutality was the same. For instance, in 1980, I was very sick in the hospital prison Gilava.
Amen, Father Victor. And actually, piggybacking on the comment that you have just made in terms of respecting and learning about the word of these contemporary confessors, when it comes to mind when Father Gheorghe actually stated that how you lose your connection with God comes in very subtle ways. It doesn't come all of a sudden. He said, and he looked at me, he said, do you think that the communism came to Romania overnight? No. It's like you watch, first you take God out of schools. Then, it's like in very small steps, and the analogy that he used at that time it's just like that crack in the windshield. Just a very annoying pebble. And before you know, the entire structure is shredded and it's compromised. Yeah, and we have, and just like yourself, you mentioned, I am just as guilty. We had so much light. Because after all of the suffering, if you actually look at his pictures and his smile, there was this inner joy. And that is unexplainable. I mean, he found, in fact, when he was dying, we actually got to spend a lot of time together in the hospital through the night, and he was praying. And he looks and said, I miss my times in prison. And I looked at him and said, how can you say such a thing, Father? And he said, Maria, even now, I know that I'm dying, but I could never pray and connect to God like I did then. Because I had nothing. I had nobody, no hope other than God. And so you see that in prison, many can find bitterness, and self-righteousness. How could they have done that? In fact, it was the only time I've experienced it, seeing Father Gheorghe not angry, but upset. It was, we went to visit a monastery, and one of his colleagues that he respects a lot, but he made a comment, well, this country owes us because we went to prison. We were sacrificed for them. And Father Gheorghe said, how could you say that, such and such? All of the sacrifice, you know what you just did. Everything that you went through, you just threw into the garbage. It was worthy nothing. If God allowed us to walk through that, it's because he wanted us to learn something from it and to give back what we had learned. So that humble spirit, and you saw Father Victor, even when Father came to St. John, he used to really enjoy, he told me that, the services in here. I said, why, Father? Because it's very traditional. He was all about tradition. And he fought for a long time to keep the services, even in the U.S., in the native language, just to keep the tradition. And he used to sit all the way in the back. I remember one of the comments that you made once, I had this saint in my church and he used to sit all the way in the back. But that's how I got to know Father Gheorghe in America. Even when we went to Vatra events, he would sit all the way in the back and waited until he was invited. And he was perfectly content. And in being in this humble area, so that to me was quite striking. And I am also guilty of not have taken advantage when I did have the choice of not spending more time with him and learning more from him. In fact, the 2 weeks that I spent with him at the hospital, and I'm happy I made that choice, even though work-wise it may not come across very right, because it was extremely impactful. here. But anyhow, let me push the spotlight where the spotlight should be today. Thank you very much, Father Victor. Thanks for everything, and we hope that one day we're going to be able to pray his Akatas. Without further delays, let's pass on to Father Leonid.
Well, I'm Deacon Leonid Mickle. I'm just this guy. I've been serving as a deacon in Father Victor's Cathedral of St. John the Baptist since 1982. And it's a little awkward for me to talk about Father Gheorghe because when I became acquainted with him, I was spiritually an infant. Like so many people in the second wave emigre community, it was a given that one was Orthodox. But what did that mean? That did not mean being a regular churchgoer. It was a tradition, it was a culture, it was all sorts of things except the main thing. In the 1970s, I started questioning where I was going, and that coincided with Father Gheorghe's, with the publication of Father Gheorghe's 7 Words for Orthodox Youth in an American publication, The Orthodox Word. And it was like a lightning bolt when he said, "Christ is calling you." And I could say, annoyed to hear that. And all of the questions he was posing to youth, although I was already an adult, were very pertinent. You start making choices. You start thinking about where your life is. And I know this talk isn't supposed to be about me, it's about Father Gheorghe, but he is one of the reasons that I angrily came up the steps of St. John's to settle once and for all what was missing from my life. And to my surprise, it was a lot more than I had thought. Later, I became personally acquainted with him, first through the committee to which Father Victor referred, through reading the Orthodox Monitor, through hearing the testimonies of various dissident clergy who came to visit. And then, to my surprise, I discovered that Father Gheorghe not only was in the United States, but he'd been assigned to a church across the street from my office building. I had a secular job. I was a government bureaucrat. And my window faced Holy Cross Church. And it became my practice that if the doors were open, he was generally puttering in the garden in front of the church, I would take a couple of hours of personal leave and go over and talk. I had heard so much about him being a giant in resistance to the atheist authorities. It simply did not comport with the image that he projected, which was radiant joy. I, of course, had been making up for all the years that I had ignored what was going on in the church. I repeatedly asked him to tell me about conditions in the camp. At that point, I had not read his accounts of life in the prisons. And he never would answer me. And again, I became annoyed and said, "Well, Father, at least what gave you the strength to endure the horrible things about which I've read that were done to you on a daily basis?" And he fixed me with a very stern gaze and said, "I'm a priest. That's all you need to know. I behaved as a priest must. The day will come, all of you in the United States will be called to behave in that same way. The only thing that will give you strength is faith in God, who is the source of all strength. And then he was back to happy, smiling, joking mode. Again, I was balancing service to the church and a career, and I did not take full advantage of his being accessible. And I only got to know him a bit more later, after he had been diagnosed with the cancer, which ultimately took him. When he left for his homeland to say goodbye to some of his spiritual children, I learned that a group of parishioners at Holy Cross were coming together on a weekly basis. May have been more often, I can't remember, to pray. And I began taking part. We did Akafist hymns to St. George, St. Panteleimon, to Our Lady, and it was an opportunity to share in the love that his flock felt for him. It was extremely moving. At that time, I was a little bit concerned that people were asking whether this could bring him healing, physical healing. And I thought of something he quoted to me, and I later saw in a video of Elder Cleopo. It was asked, what is the most important thing you should think of as you are structuring your life? And he said, morta, 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 morta. To live with the recognition that you're going to die, but to maintain that joy in the fact that you live here on earth in God's love, and that you are called to cultivate that quiet light in your own life, that fosilaros, in which I never saw disappear from his countenance. When he returned, he went from Dulles Airport to Fairfax Hospital, and there was continuous prayer for the next 3 days. And struck me as very interesting that over the course of all of that time, the nurses recognized who they were dealing with. 8 o'clock visiting hours are over. They drive everybody out of the room. There'd be 15, 25 people at any given time, although 2 visitors are the maximum that's allowed. And they would go off into the hall, and then the nurses would go back to the nursing station and we would return. And as encouragement to leave, and you can verify this, about 10 o'clock they turned out the lights. But people continued to read and pray because the light was there. When he reposed, instantly someone took a large candle, placed it in his hands, and lit it. When the nurses came in to begin stripping the bed and all of that, no one put out the candle.
That's the candle.
No one said, there's oxygen flowing here, there are warnings. There was never any question. They saw that a righteous person who prayed, who lived in the light of Christ, had reposed. How did he affect me? Through that joy, through that happiness that he manifested. no matter what the situation. This seems to be, at least in my limited contact with people who have gone through the camps, have gone through the prisons, is a common typical characteristic. They're happy to be here because they are happy to be living with being fully conscious that this is only temporary and that they are moving toward our common goal. How does he affect others? Well, I know that he has affected thousands, if not millions, with those 7 words for Orthodox youth. Someone who is as old as I am could reread them and gain even more than initially gained, but simply by his example. I never heard him condemn any one of his torturers. I read, Julia, in one of your articles that he turned everything that he had experienced into love and compassion for those who were torturing him. We're called to love one another. This is how Christ will know that we are his children. And by his example, not even necessarily by his words, but simply by his example, he affected everyone that he encountered. I once described him to someone who was Russian-speaking as Svetloy Lichnost, a bright or glowing personality. And she said, "You saw it too?" Mm. But you look at people, you can see that inner light, whether it's visible externally or not. They live in that light. And I thank God that I have the joy of meeting him, if only very, very briefly.